I want you to imagine that it's 1985. You slide a floppy disk into your Atari 8-bit home computer, and this happens. The system's sound chip is keeling over, struggling to play this dramatic, triumphant theme. And then this happens? This is different. This is alternate reality, the city. Among CRPG enthusiasts, it has quite the reputation. Some rank it as one of the greatest in the genre, maybe even of all time. Philip Price was beyond a computer whiz. He was practically John Carmack levels of programming adept. His first games were programmed while a freshman in high school, using knowledge from self-paced courses he'd taken meant for senior students. He graduated at 16 and enrolled at the Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. While there, he was reprimanded for making a multiplayer game whose players were disrupting some other students' study time. That game was called Star Wars, about a year before the blockbuster hit theaters. A running theme of Price's work would be ahead of its time, because a few years later, he would be living in Hawaii with his father, where work was slim. He formed a relationship with a computer dealer who agreed to let him use his Atari 8-bit PC. Without any documentation, Price was able to reverse engineer the hardware to map its chips to the correct registers and use it for programming. Quote, "Eventually, I ended up living in a shack owned by the computer dealer in the backwoods of Hawaii. There was no running water. Electricity to power the computer came from the Jeep of the computer dealer. We would go to the beach and shower using the outdoor showers, a bar of soap, and swimming trunks. At the same computer store, he would run into Gary Gilbertson, a Juilliard graduate, and just who Price needed. He was finishing up a game called Tale of Beta Larai, and in the process, created his own digital music language. By his own admission, he was a subpar composer, but Gary was more than talented enough to lend a soundtrack. Even in the text scroll of this early title, you can see the level of thought Price put into his creations. He writes out this whole fleshed-out backstory for what amounts to a pretty simple space shooter. Their next collaboration would be an incredible leap forward, in both technology and ambition. Alternate reality, The City, released 1985, sees you abducted by aliens before opening your eyes to a gate. You are now in Xebek's demise, Xebek being an ancient Mediterranean sailing ship, alluding to the city being founded from the crash of an alien ship. Not these aliens. Those aliens had apparently encountered another race whose trading ship had crash-landed, kicking off these aliens' space travel. Now, I say apparently because the only place this is confirmed is in a forum thread on Atari Age, where Philip Price himself answered users' questions. We'll get to why this is never brought up in the game, but first, we need to get to the game. This is the point where I get kind of negative. I skimmed over this at first, but the city uses multiple discs to transition between different scenes. This wasn't uncommon, especially for that era, but my first gripe is with the way that it affects the game overall. Let's say you're playing this on an Atari 8-bit machine, as my emulator is. You boot up the game, watch an unskippable 4-minute long intro, then you're in a loading screen, fair enough. Now you have the option to create a new character, resume an existing one, or so on. If you go with the sensible choice of creating a new person, you are told, "This is not a character disc." After swapping discs again, you are then taken to the stat lottery screen. Alright, got my character and... we're joined. We made it, let's go. Oh, okay, gotta swap the disc again. Okay. We're finally... Oh, gotta swap it out again. We're finally here. Zebek's demise. A couple things to note here. First is the perspective. First-person games had been done before, but the three-dimensional effect had always been achieved with static images you progressed through one at a time. This game features smooth scrolling environments achieved with, you're not gonna believe this, ray casting. Now, if you don't know, ray casting, not ray tracing, is a graphics technique used to render two-dimensional environments as if they were three-dimensional. In first-person games, where it would later be used extensively, two rays would be sent out from the player's location at angles. When these rays hit a tile in the environment, they would register it as well as anything in between, letting the game know the height and other information like specific textures. This is then rendered for the player. The most notable use of raycasting would be in id Software's 1992 classic, Wolfenstein 3D. That's 8 years after The City. This game's raycasting is slightly clunkier, only allowing for 90-degree turns, but the innovation is impressive. Because the environment isn't a series of still images strung together, background elements can be included, like waterfalls in the distance, the sun setting. The streets can flood when it rains. That's another thing, persistent weather. There are actually hidden stats in this game that the player can never see, such as hunger and thirst, making this an early example of a survival management mechanic. You also have a good or evil alignment that changes depending on your actions. Price really wanted to stress the idea of free will, and this is one of the most free will games I've ever seen. You see, the city is large, open-ended, and has no goal. Or, well, it was supposed to. The vision for alternate reality was unprecedented. It was to be a massive, 7-game epic. But the other games weren't sequels in the traditional sense. They were to be much more like expansions. You would go to the arena in the city, and be prompted to insert your disc for alternate reality, the arena. Once you were there, you'd explore a story about humanity's love of violence and compete in limited PvP battles. Heading to the palace would plunge you into a world of political intrigue, where you could buy land, alter the city's layout, and even become king. After venturing through the wilderness, overcoming beasts and traps, the player would discover a metal door at the end of a cave. Inside would be alternate reality, the revelation, where it would come to light that the entire fantasy world was just a simulation being run by aliens who abducted you. All of the humans taken from Earth are cocooned up and living out their lives for the amusement of the aliens. Finally, alternate reality Destiny would raise more questions about existence, with the twist that, even outside of the city, the player's body is just a projection, and that they've actually still been in the cocoon this whole time. You could continue your life in the simulation, living in eternal luxury, or turn it off. Maybe just escape back to Earth, bring the ship to Earth to be studied, sell out humanity, or even destroy the planet. If parts of that story sound familiar at all, You've probably heard of The Matrix. Mind you, this was all drafted by the first game's release in 1985. I guess Star Wars wasn't the first blockbuster hit Price unknowingly predicted. Actually, in that Atari Age thread, he suggests that the Wachowskis may have stolen his idea? Quote, "All I know is what I said before. I was in Westwood near UCLA at a restaurant and two guys sat at my table. And we talked about what was wrong with the current movie that was out. Forget what it was. And then I described what my vision for AR had been. And they turned and said, 'You know, ideas cannot be copyrighted,' with a smile. They could have been anyone, and I think we all make use of the stories we hear over the years, so if they were them, that's okay. If they weren't, that's okay too." He then lists some other inspirations he'd had for the series' plot, and goes on to say, "So if it was them and it provided a little inspiration, great. If it wasn't and the two strangers got inspired in any way, that's good too. The timing of their remark in the later movie was the only strange thing, and why I originally made the remark. But I also heard that they were inspired by a comic book / graphic novel. That's cool too. I originally just shared it because it was a weird experience at the time, and how fate sometimes is fickle." Now, I've been dancing around it, but the alternate reality series never happened. There was one more game, The Dungeon, released 2 years later. Even that isn't a true entry though. The publisher, Datasoft, demanded that the city be released early, and thus the second half of the game, The Sewers, was carved off and repackaged as The Dungeon. By that time, Price had left the project due to poor pay. According to him, Datasoft had included a clause in their contract that 100% of the costs from porting could be deducted from any profits he made. At a rate of 7.5%, he and Gilbertson made literally zero money from the game, despite its commercial success. Datasoft had it ported to a number of systems, including Commodore 64, Apple II, Amiga, DOS, and more. Side note, apparently the version of the city on iOS was not made with Price's permission, and the guy who put it up is shamelessly cheating him out of any revenue, so think twice if you see it on the App Store. The team left to finish The Dungeon regularly spoke with Price as he gave them instructions on what he had planned for The Sewers, and the finished product does have his stamp of approval. So here it is, alternate reality, The City. I would describe it as a few things. Impressive from a technological and gameplay perspective, and a strong creative vision. I would not describe it as fun, enjoyable. Look, I'm sorry, if this game means a lot to you, I respect that, but I just can't get behind it. Without the dungeon, there's no goal to work towards in the city. Here's how it goes. You start, run into some enemies, mash either A or L to attack them until eventually one of you dies, hopefully them. Collect experience, collect money, buy equipment, rinse, repeat, but scaled up to stronger enemies. It is slow, monotonous, and easy to fail. A large percentage of the footage I have is just me switching discs or waiting for things to load. In the Atari 8-bit version, I can't seem to enter shops. I go in, see the prompt to change the disc, I do so, hit F7, then it loads, then it tells me to switch back, so I do so, and then it boots me back outside. I have no idea what I'm doing wrong, but this doesn't happen with the Commodore 64 version, so I ended up playing more of that. The Commodore version, however, does feel the need to load every single time you get into a random encounter. Then you mash A, or escape, then it loads, and if you won, it shows you what you earned, then it loads again, then you're back in the city. If you're playing the original, you still have to wait for load times, and if you die, You wait through an unskippable funeral song with karaoke, only to realize you have to reset the machine. Then you wait through an unskippable 4-minute intro before... Oh god, is the loading screen frozen? It's stuck. I guess I have to reset again. And wait through the intro again. The saving grace here is the music. I can't stress how catchy that intro is, and it made it somewhat bearable to sit through every time. Gilbertson's work is great, and I wish he'd worked on more games. When I read through the nostalgic opinions of this game, terms like wonder come up a lot, and I think I get it. The world is handcrafted with lots of intentionality, and I can imagine being a kid in the late 80s in awe of what seems like so many unexplained mysteries. It does manage to evoke the sensation that something much more complex is happening behind the scenes, which was the goal in the first place. Playing the city began as a thing of curiosity, and it eventually became an obligation, mostly to get footage. I found myself thinking of other games I could be playing. The ideas on display are revolutionary, the thought put into the setting extraordinary, but they never coalesce into a whole package. The moment-to-moment gameplay is too tedious and unfortunately amounts to nothing for that tedium. Ultima 4 released the same year, and I can't help but compare the two as groundbreaking philosophical games. However, one was never to be. There are reminders at every corner of what this series could have been, quite literally. The concept of disc switching to play through one massive epic of several expansions doesn't make sense now that the period of floppy disks has passed. It's a shame too, because reading through Price's plans is so intriguing. Sure, a lot of it sounds far out there, and some parts give me the inklings of John Romero Daikatana hype, but then again, they're just drafts, and could have come through in the end. Price always intended for the data to be carried over between expansions, including the dungeon, but he rarely commented on his code, leaving those in charge of porting unaware of the feature. Thus, the only version that can transfer data is the original Atari 8-bit SKUs. Price went on to program the console of the B-2 stealth bomber. He's actually the reason it uses C++. As of the 2013 Atari Age thread, he was working in cybersecurity and hoping to retire with a pension so he could get back to writing games. It's relatively unknown what Gary Gilbertson has done since The Dungeon. Every now and again, alternate reality is brought up as one of the great unfinished epics of gaming. While I don't like this game, I can't disagree, because we just don't know. It's a fascinating story about passion, genius, and art. An Icarus that never left the ground. We can only visit its burial site and dream about its wings.